Reading. It's a good book.
Looky there. It's time for us to do the work. And Terry's actually reading a book. How are you doing today, Terry?
I'm doing the work.
Okay. Well, isn't that special?
Got a little Mark Roberts action going on here. Little, by the way, autographed copy.
Yeah, that's a good question. Can you? There's a problem now with digital editions. You really can't truly autograph editions.
You what now?
You can autograph your digital edition. Like if you can log off version of a thing, that's not a thing anymore.
Yeah, that's the one downside of not having real books, right?
In fact, there's maybe a function of that role that we need to revisit. So we're a few minutes behind schedule at a tech issue we fixed. It should be addressed from now and forward, and so we're good there. Terry, you were slotted.
You say we're good.
Oh,
you say we're good.
You were slotted for our B-roll question for this fine Tuesday morning. What you got?
Well, so tonight is graduation here locally. It's outside. And today's supposed to be one of the hottest days of the year to this point. And I kind of have a senior, like not biologically, but Jillian's best friend, who's kind of like our adopted daughter at this point, just kind of like the add-on bonus daughter.
The plus daughter?
Yeah, Devin graduates tonight, and so we have tickets to go. And I'm excited about going to see Devin graduate to support her. And at the same time, I dread going to sit outside in 90-degree heat for a whole graduating class. And the only thing that this compares to is when my sister-in-law graduated from Vanderbilt. We were inside Memorial Gymnasium, I think in June or July. There's no air conditioning there, and it was like a hot box. It was crazy.
Right.
So I'm just going to say graduations are one of those things that I dread because of that bad experience and when you add the outside. So what is it that you know you want to go to, Phil? You want to do this, is to support somebody, but you really don't want to go to. Like, what is it? What is yours? Be honest now. Because there's some other stuff. Because let's be honest, as guys, weddings has been on that list at times.
Yeah, generally the weddings I go to, I can't skip.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Like most of the time, we're an important part of the wedding.
Yeah. Yeah, graduations in general are not something that is a thrilling experience for a lot of folks. What's up, Chris? He's glad you're here. So, yeah, I will say that here's a solution for you, Terry. Go get yourself a large Coleman cooler, a 6-inch hole saw, and a battery-operated fan, and 2 boxes of ice.
Oh, I know. I can make my own air conditioner, but I think they're going to frown upon that. And how middle school band recitals aren't nearly as bad as graduation. Like, I got to tell you, my son's graduation was indoors, but there was like over 600 kids and like way too many speeches that some of them were very funny, but just reading through like my son's graduating class of 600 and some like 70 something, that it just is brutal. It's brutal.
Yeah, Jesse's graduation was out on the football field, May Georgia heat, and I drew the intentional short straw of getting there early to mark out the territory for the best spot. I think I lost like 3 pounds that day, so there's some hidden value. They did have to potentially bring in, like, rehydrate me with an IV afterwards. No, they didn't, but it felt like that.
Okay, I'm going to throw this out there and hope that my family's not listening because they don't listen to me anyway. Like, there's a part of me that just wants to show up because her name starts with an S. Show up, like, somewhere in the R's and just skip all the speeches and all that stuff at the beginning and just catch her walking across the stage, which is why you're going to sit there that whole time anyway.
Yeah.
I mean, in some ways, how's that any different from the people who come to church and just take the Lord's Supper and leave? Just gonna throw that out there.
So
anyway,
intellectually,
on to bad sermons.
Intellectually, is not a high school diploma almost a participation trophy?
I mean, yeah, if she was barely graduating, but she's a good kid, and
Right.
she's going to Huntsville to get an engineering degree, and so that's why I'm going.
Diploma.
By the way, kids, if you run across this, my kids, anybody's kids, if we sit through a graduation outside in the middle of May or June for you, just realize that's how much we love you, because there's no other reason we would do that.
Well, no other reasonable reason, I suppose.
Yeah.
All right. So,
by the way, she's not looking forward to it either, because she's in that warm, hot robe. Like, dude, it's like your own personal walking sauna out there. It's not fun for them either.
Yeah, maybe get one of those mascot cool suits. The cooling suits they put underneath the mascots. I think that would probably be a wise rental investment. Probably own at this point. You probably want to own something like that, not rent somebody else's.
Just get like an air conditioning suit, Yeah. Yeah.
So last week we kind of foretold part of our subject matter for today, and we're talking about bad sermons.
Why do bad sermons happen to good people?
Yeah, so we've got a lot of content, at least, to dig through there. But really, it's as our little title things. What about sermons gone bad? And Terry and I both follow a couple of social media accounts that have excerpts of really, really special clips of sermons across the sermosphere.
Did you see the one this week did you see the one that I shared this week?
Yeah.
Describing Potiphar's wife as a cougar.
Yes.
Yes. I may have to drop a link for that in the old show notes here.
That'll happen here at some point.
Yeah.
But what we're going to do is we're certainly going to bring up some of the things, maybe from our own personal experiences, maybe from sermons we've heard, that really are just bad sermons from the get-go. Chris Huntley wants to know our sources for bad sermon clips, and so Terry's probably going to link something somewhere. It might show up here in a second.
There's a couple.
But really what you're looking at here, at least on a let's get into the thing, is we're going to talk about three things to break down the subject. Bad sermons to begin with, bad actors, and bad hearts. Those things together will produce a bad sermon one way or another. And let's now kind of define each of those areas as we inch through a little bit of comedy. There's some fun things there, but also just a real good understanding of, hey, look, from our standpoint as evangelists, a standpoint as kingdom workers, a lot of this can actually be avoided. So at the top of the table then, Terry, what is, and you can pick either your worst sermon idea or the worst sermon idea you've encountered recently. In the chat, you can give other folks ones as well.
My worst sermon idea, man.
I got some bad ones, but
I think here lately I've tried to avoid a lot of those. I could tell you years ago there was a sermon idea that I had that I thought was really, really great, and it was based all off of one title off of a book, and honestly, it was one of those deals where I probably should have not gone that way, and it was called Escape from Meville. And it was about selfishness, but it wasn't the best sermon. And it was totally motivated by a book title, which was Nothing Better Than Just a Book Title.
Yeah.
So, which happens. Yeah. So that's probably the worst one I can remember. There's also another one that I did. By the way, all these are oddly enough tied to really great graphic opportunities that drove this motivation, which, by the way, if your motivation for a sermon topic is how cool the PowerPoint's going to look, probably not the best motivation. Yeah. Another one is called Fast Food Religion. And
I think
PowerPoint
everybody had a
really,
version of that.
Yeah, the PowerPoint had a really impressive, like, greasy Big Mac picture
Yeah.
on it. Yeah.
I think I have one
Um,
in that same space called the Church of Your Choice. You can have it your way.
well,
Um,
I had one that was called "Choosing to Church Like a Cereal." And by the way, it was a really great. It is a great illustration that the same way you choose cereals is the same way a lot of people choose churches. It just looking back, and those are like 10, 15 years ago. It's like those are the horror sermons where you look back and go, "Man, what was I thinking?" It was you don't need a gimmick. I guess is the main thing to think about. You don't need a gimmick. Um, so like, there you
so
go.
I had a sermon entitled "The Cross of Christ" that I had assembled together from a 7-part series about aspects of the cross, and I put it into one sermon with one set of PowerPoints that tried to kludge together all those things in a sermon, like not a series, it became a sermon. And that was the most overbearing, ill-defined, inexplicably, could have been good but never was bad sermon, in part because it was also the first time I got to use a projector. So you can guess
Oh,
how many points that I
yeah.
had for that.
You had a whole file box of transparencies to put up there, right? Was it an overhead projector or an
No,
actual
no, this
media
was
projector?
the first time I had an in-focus projector.
PowerPoint.
So I had like 49 PowerPoints,
Do
PowerPoint
you
charts
did
with
you
animations.
Oh yeah, do you remember back when like our PowerPoint was like 50 slides and we put every verse and we like drew circles around important words and like underlined stuff, and man, we thought that was just the most awesome thing. And I look back and I go, "Oh, this is terrible." Like the text art coming in and flashing,
Yeah.
look at this. Yeah. No, that's bad. It's real
So
bad.
the first 2 sermons I ever used PowerPoint software for were sermons delivered when I was a student at Florida College at the Seffner congregation. The first one I put together in the old computer lab space in the old business classrooms over by the country club. And the second one I put together on the computers in the library, and printed them out, with black and white charts, but I printed them out onto transparencies, and I had a nice stack of transparencies, and I had a stack of awful things. Like I thought they were great, but they were really not good. Um,
Yeah.
so that was easily like the worst sermon, and it's like the title isn't even bad. Like it's totally a good title. Like there's nothing wrong with that. But I made it bad. Um, but then
Well,
I
I think
also
one of the
saw.
things is one of the problems I have sometimes is like the whole gimmick approach to everything, right? Like I think it's one of those deals where that's for me, that's one of the things that, like, okay, let's Sunday falls on May 4th. Let's make that a Star Wars sermon, you
Mm-hmm.
know. And look, I think there was a time period, at least when I was younger, and probably you too, that like you felt like what was more important than your content for a while was either your PowerPoint or your title or your sermon or both. Like I got to have a really good title to catch people with.
Yeah.
And the older I get, it's like, who cares
Like
about
this
the
is going to
title?
be the hook. This is going to hook
Yeah,
them in.
yeah,
Content wasn't
yeah,
my hook.
yeah.
Quality media was the hook.
Because like John Popper said, the hook will bring you back. I mean,
That's right. Which is
that's
true.
what it's, yeah. So, and we all bought into that. So, I mean, I have a friend I joked around with that did a sermon about the zombie apocalypse, and I've had people that have brought Harry Potter up, or Andy Griffith, or there's a whole host of things that you could tie into that motivate your sermon title, PowerPoint content. By the way, all of those things were topical sermons, is what they turn into. Like you can't do anything tied into Star Wars and be textual. It doesn't happen. So
Yeah.
that's another one of those challenges to all of that.
So recently, I saw a sermon graphic work put together entitled "The Goat," and the sermon series was basically Jesus is the goat, the greatest of all time. And I'm like, do the people not understand that there's some problematic theology that maybe we don't necessarily want to have you know, Jesus being the scapegoat if we're not comfortable with that consequence and we don't see him in that regard and we can't explain the duality potential of the
By the
scapegoat
way,
and the lamb.
when he called him the goat, did he get to the scapegoat, or was he just the goat for the other angle?
It's a 4-point series that a bunch of
Had
churches
nothing
now have done, and it's all about. It shows a picture of a goat, and it's all about the greatest of all time. It has nothing to do with the theology whatsoever.
Like the most obvious theological tie-in. Nah, we're gonna go right past that. I mean, how many of those guys start off their first lesson on the goat with a picture of Tom Brady in their PowerPoint? I'm gonna say 7 out of 10. I'm going to say 7 out of 10.
It's all about age. So if you go back 10 years in age from those guys, they're going to start with Michael Jordan.
Yeah. Hey, look, between Emerson and Monk and Cheney, they would all be starting that off with LeBron versus Jordan for a GOAT series, let's be honest. Because if you've been friends with those guys, they've been arguing about that for 5 years. So, fun stuff. Yeah. Jesus. By the way, Edwin says, sorry I'm late. Seeing the title causes me to say sounds like Sunday at Livingston. I just have to ask you, did Jesse preach last Sunday? Is that a reference to your kid, or I'm just trying to figure out the timeline of this.
Jesse preached Sunday, and so there has to be something else because
I'll just straight up. Because your kid did a great job because he stole one of your sermons.
Actually, he didn't really. I did help him with the title. But that's a dad level thing. I'll tell you this straight. Jesse's first full sermon at Livingston was better than the first 2 years of my full-time work.
Probably better than the first 10 years of my full-time work, honestly.
And that's a credit to Edwin and Andrew. No,
it's a credit to Andrew. Let's just be honest. Yeah. Don't give Edwin any credit.
True.
Don't give Edwin any credit. Yeah.
And Jesse's mom.
Jesse's mom.
Yeah.
Who shall remain nameless and never be on camera.
Yeah. That would break the internet at that point, I think.
Yes, it would. So we've talked about bad series. Let's talk about bad actors because it's already 20 after. We've had a lot. This is a fun conversation, just not a lot of meat here. Sort of like the sermons from my first 10 years of preaching. Bad actors. I think one of the things just to start off is sometimes a bad actor is you. I think that's in this regard it is. So there's a lot of things, Phil. Let you get started. What could make us bad actors in the pulpit?
Well, please understand the bad actor is not limited to the idea of hypocrisy, the typical use of an actor who is pretending.
Right.
Your bad behavior influences everything. I was in a conversation Sunday that I kind of realized an aspect of my own preaching that I mentioned yesterday in a little blurb, that the tone of the sermon sets everything else to its right place. And it's really easy to become monotone in your preaching. And I use the illustration, if your preaching is mean, that's the only tone of your preaching, then it doesn't matter what you preach on. There's a sermon I heard back when Jesse was about 2. And it was a reworking of the dialogue between Jesus and Peter on the subject of love. And the tone of the sermon was so aggressive that the babies in the assembly were crying because they were scared. It was so loud and so bombastic.
It's a sermon on love that's so aggressive that babies are crying. Right. That's perfect delivery right there. That's what we're looking for.
By a very talented, very well-studied guy who is a good guy.
Peter, don't you love me?
So the tone is an evidence of the sermon, and God presents to us sermons that fill this whole surround sound space of how, look, there are times when our sermons need to be aggressive, like really forceful in delivery, but the tone gets balanced and couched in our individual mortality, our individual spiritual reality, so that it's the right space for that. And Edwin's here so I can do this. I would have done it anyway. I think 2 times.
I've stopped you before.
Yeah. two times during his, at least two times during his lecture, he intentionally boomed up his volume to probably max Edwin or close to it. And it was loud and shocking, but it was part of his delivery. And so that tone was intentional and necessary because it offset the rest of the message.
Yeah.
You know, I wonder if Edwin and I were in the same assembly.
So I'll tell you this, that I know that I'm typically loud, but a couple times in the past month or two, I've been told by more than one of our elderly members that there are times they can't hear me because I get too soft, which I didn't know was possible. And that's all intentional. That voice play, that dynamic is all intentional. And I can tell you, my first probably 8 to 10 years of preaching, the compliment I got a lot from people was that I reminded them of that old time hellfire and brimstone preaching, which at the time I think I took as a compliment. Looking back, I don't necessarily see it that way, because that probably means that a lot of things I said weren't delivered the right way. And so that could be part of it. And so I think the way you present something is really important.
So in that space of bad actors, Terry pointed out that like the preacher can be the bad actor. We could have our motivation out of sorts. But let me also include this little tidbit. It connects. It's like a transition between bad sermon, bad series to bad actor. You can build a sermon in such a poor way that not only tonally it's deaf, but it doesn't actually interact with the message of grace that God is kind of presenting in the story of his interaction with humanity. You can offer no solutions to a problem because you're just upset, or it's, again, poorly planned, poorly worded, poorly laid out, or you're responding to an imaginary villain that really doesn't need to be the focus of all of that.
And sometimes you introduce problems that aren't problems, and sometimes you introduce problems that don't have a solution. Both are bad things. And you mentioned the idea of responding. I think one of the dangers in preaching, we're both big proponents of planning. And you and I both plan pretty long term. We plan annually at this point. Now, there's flexible spots in there, but for the most part, we plan annually. One of the reasons I started doing that, is because I was more of a reactionary preacher. If I wasn't careful, my preaching would be motivated and would be a response to whatever current event, dominant thing happened. I mean, I'll give you a good example that we all did this. How many of us preached about the Da Vinci Code, right? When that book came out or when the movie came out, and how all this is wrong, because it's just going to be a problem. And what happened is the Da Vinci Code that we all thought was going to be this huge problem, it wasn't a problem at all. And I don't know about you, Phil, you may not have done that, but I fell into that trap and did all of this reading and all of this research for something that didn't matter. There was a Discovery special about the Jesus tomb and how they found the bones of Jesus. And again, did all this research and all this stuff to prove that wrong. And in the end, nobody cared anyway. And looking back, those were wasted opportunities to connect to the gospel and to grace and to do things that were way more productive than responding to some current event. Planning helps avoid that. Responding to, and Hal talks about this, defending yourself against private accusation or criticism. Whenever you weaponize the pulpit, you use a response to make the pulpit a weapon. That's really a form of abusing your power as the evangelist there. It's just a bad idea. It's a bad idea. And that goes into what Edwin said. In his early years, he had this tone and underlying feeling that he was supposed to fix everybody. And the reality is, what happens is that is part of being a bad actor, because when you get in the idea, and I've been there too, and Phil, you probably have too, my job's to fix everybody. I'm to fix these sinners out there. And you get so amped up on your ability to do that and your pride and your arrogance that you forget you're one of those sinners out there too. And I can tell you, my tone changed when I started realizing just how sinful I was and what I needed to work on myself before I started trying to work on everybody else.
Yeah. These are all things that fit into a certain space too. Like most people I know are somewhat aware of that concern. They're somewhat aware of the risk. They're somewhat aware of what it's like to be on the receiving end of those things. But from a planning your preaching standpoint, more than just your topics or your texts, learn to be mindfully aware of this is something that I should be careful about. Um, you know, there's a lot that subtly comes out, so that we can kind of really, hey, Edwin, you can comment on any of it and see it in the stream, because it's all live there. You can see your comments too.
That's why he put it there, because he knows he can see it, but he just can't like it on Facebook. By the way, Edwin, Chris is like the one person watching on Phil Martin's page, and the rest of you seem to be watching on Do the Work. But that's the difference there.
Yeah, that's probably on. I can break it down for you. There's a demographic of who's where. We've probably got one guy on YouTube, 2 or 3 on my page, a bunch on Do the Work.
Twitch. Do we have any Twitchers today?
We do have a Twitch viewer. One Twitch viewer. I don't know who it is, but they're consistent. We are the most watched religious broadcast on Twitch.
He's twitching.
Yeah.
As he watches
more
us.
so now.
Absolutely.
So again, new steps for bad actors. Bad actors can also be part of the leadership or non-leadership components of the congregation that influence your preaching. They might be an opinionated giver. They might be one of the elders or deacons that is overbearing in regards to their influence on your subject, on your schedule of delivery, or any of those factors that push, particularly younger preachers, is kind of the context of our conversation here sometimes, but all of us around. All of that is, again, part of the things you need to be mindful of when you're crafting the sermon early on. It's one of the reasons why I try to write things out more, is to avoid some of that, but it's not limited to that. It's totally something that could be covered and clarified with outlines, like a little note, hey, don't do this. Little side comment notes, be mindful of all of that.
Emerson's thing about passages made me laugh, because I call those concordant sermons, and I used to do those too. Like you would find like 8 passages about one thing to try to prove that, and as you kind of mature in your prep, your sermon prep, and in your preaching, I think you find out that it does, a point can stand on 1 verse or 6. You don't have to have 6. Yeah. And there needs to be, and that's one of the things when I've worked with young guys to try to teach them, is because you need to understand that one passage sometimes is all that you need. And especially if you try to kind of sit on that one passage. The other issue comes into play there, Phil, and this gets into that topical versus textual. And I'm not saying not to do topical sermons, but the danger of just strictly topical preaching is not only proof texting, but it is what Carl Peterson talks about, machine gun preaching, where you just try to cram as many verses as you can into it. Right. And there's a danger there. By the way, the Hal and Paul Hammond's conversation is highly entertaining. Is it just, I'm sitting over here laughing when we get to the point that Pharaoh lived and didn't die in the Red Sea because Yul Brynner did not go into the sea in the movie. It's good stuff right there. That's
Are you discussing this?
Yeah, that's fantastic right there.
We'll suppress that for their own good.
Yeah, that's really good. If you want to see that, go to the Do the Work page. There's a sideshow going over there that's pretty entertaining.
Yeah. So let me add a couple other things to think about in this bigger space of let's kind of clarify. All of us have, at some point or another, tried to demonstrate our intricate knowledge of every single passage that we could pull in on this, as a sense of, well, now we're teaching. Because maybe we're A couple of old preachers in Texas I knew used to have these flip chart sermons where they would just literally quote off 1,000 scriptures in a sermon all the time. Some of those guys from Texas probably know a couple of the men I'm talking about. Great guys, did great work. But that sermon style has a limited value in the bigger development as an evangelist, as a teacher, as a leader. There's a time for that. And young guys, from my own individual experience, we don't always necessarily kind of get that right.
Did you just call us young guys, by the way? I like that reference.
Yeah, when we were young.
When we were young.
Yeah.
By the way, I'll throw in there not just trying to see how many verses you can quote is part of bad acting, but trying to see how many times you can reference the Greek is another one of those deals. Like there's a lot of those kind of things you'll try to throw in there to try to prove your worth that probably just are better off not done. So just be cautious about that. Sometimes that comes and just doesn't come across well. It doesn't mean that there's not a place to go, hey, this word points to this. It's completely different than getting into a 5-minute discussion of the Greek word ice in Acts 2:38. And just be cautious about that. It's the same thing.
Yeah. It's a way to think about it this way. Almost all of us, at some point, were either by choice or forced to take a foreign language in school. At the end of those 2 years of education in that concept, you now have the ability to ask where the bathroom is and end up in the garage.
Dando el español.
Yeah. That's the equivalent of a couple of years of Greek in some senses. And so you're not an expert. I'm not an expert. The experts have nuance and skills that we don't. But here, that's not the issue. The issue is that your audience is not going to value the expertise and the nuance that's there. And so your goal is to refine and define what you know and explain it in a way that doesn't require you to say, hey, in the Greek. Because if that's what you have to do, you're probably wrong. Not that you're theologically wrong, that your approach is not sensitive to your audience, which again is a bad actor. Here's one more. And this kind of leads into the bad heart side of things, which we've kind of been hinting at. You become a bad actor when your heart is so calloused, like Edwin pointed out earlier, to either your own sin or the sensitivity that's needed to address the sins of others. And the biblical text that I'm kind of connecting it to is this simple premise. If I go to take out the small little speck in my brother's eye, but the beam or spar that exists in my own is so substantial that I'm whacking them over the head up with it through the entire sermon, then nobody wins. No good comes of that. And I think that's something that we have to internalize, that and every Sunday it's expected of the preacher to have cleansed himself morally before he preaches. But realistically, that is not the reality. It is not we can go into the car wash on Saturday night and come out for Sunday morning without the consequences of our rebellion for the past week.
Look, I'll be honest. There's times I've got up to preach and I'm still angry at my wife about something that morning when I get up to preach. And the reason I'm that way is because half of you out there in the audience are still angry at your wife for something she did that morning too. It's no different. Like, we're real people. And I think that's the hard thing. The important part to remember is the humility of knowing that's who you are. Like, you bring your baggage to the pulpit with you. And so we need to be careful about that, and we need to be as good, but it should be humbling, because having that just awareness changed me from looking down on the audience to being one of the audience, even though I'm the one presenting. You put Carl's thing up there. I can tell you why I think we start off with concordant sermons a little bit is, for me, when I was younger, I felt like that was my only way to establish credibility, was with a presentation of lots of biblical knowledge. And I think that's why you're tempted as a younger guy to, if you reference the original word to attempt to say the Greek word. Here's what's funny when I would do that rarely, because I never knew Greek, never taken a Greek class. First off, if I quote a Greek word, I'm going to mispronounce it anyway. Like, I don't even know what I'm saying. So I sound stupid to begin with. I'm talking about myself. And, but I did that to try to establish credibility. Whereas now, and I don't know about you, Phil, but I may say, hey, in the original language, this word just means this, and go past there. And you can still do that, but I'm not trying to impress anybody with some fake knowledge I don't have. There'll be times I'll even say, I don't know Greek, but I got friends who do, and I've talked to them, and this is what the word means. That's kind of the idea there. I think concordant sermons are kind of the same way. It was a way to prove, and Chris alluded to that earlier, when you're younger, you feel like you've got to have this quota of verses to prove that you know what you're doing. Because the opposite of that, Phil, is we kind of take a verse and we explain what it's saying. Well, when you're 25 years old, who cares what you're saying? Who wants to listen to what you're saying? So I'll just give them 6 passages instead. Right. That's at least my background.
Here's a little space for that, and I'll answer it this way. When you think about the 3 things that are typically given to young preachers by well-intentioned, good people. Number 1, Strong's Concordance. Number 2, Vines. Number 3, a sermon outline book.
Yeah.
By that person's favorite preacher. Those are all well-intentioned, good-hearted things that are done, but they have the absolute worst negative outcome.
Guess what's missing from my shelves, by the way? Strong's, Vines, and outline books. I have none of them anymore. It's just... and I had a bunch of them. I had 3 copies of Vines. I don't know why I needed that, but I had it at one time.
Given a time machine, things that you could give to a young preacher to help improve things so much earlier in their work is 1. A book by Mortimer Alter called How to Read a Book. Learn how to read. Learn how to read with intention. That's a great book. Number 2, any of the varieties of books that tell you how to write your own sermon. I don't care, a good one, bad one. Give them that before you give a sermon outline book. And then sit with them and encourage for them to think about God. Actually go and ponder what you just read in the text and just think about it. That's way better than Strong's and Vines. And my side solution for that is I find a translation that is not my normal translation that gives enough of a second reading of the text from a good quality basket of translations to explain all of that. Concordance sermons very often are given with the lowest level of expectations. There's not a lot of work that goes into that. It's just a super lazy way to solve the thing. And I'll say that with plainness. A concordance sermon is lazy work. Or it's the work done by someone who hasn't been trained to be a craftsman. Well, you can do a ton of work in a concordance sermon, and then you end up with the same bad.
By the way, Chris Emerson, no posting links to anything but Logos, because we're Logos sponsored here. I thought everybody knew that by now.
Yeah, I almost banned him, but I just not to.
Yeah, I mean that's this is do the work using Logos only. You should have learned that by now. And as to your request to debate one day, it's personal preference. We're not saying you can't do it week to week, but for both of us, planning is what works for us.
Go talk to Mark Roberts. He explained this for you. You can still have week-to-week things while you have a plan, and you can still respond to the needs and ebbs and flows of a congregation. So actually, I'm going to have the vicarious debate where I have 2 Texas preachers of import, Chris Emerson and Mark Roberts. I'll provide coffee, and we're going to.
I'll bring the popcorn. Let's do that. By the way, Paul Hammonds, I'll just tell you, you get what you pay for, brother. You get what you pay for. No, there's a lot of free stuff out there. Just kidding around. There's a lot of free stuff. But do remember that this is not part of our stuff. I'll just say this. I'll do this instead of Phil. Free stuff is free because it's eminent domain, which means it's older. So you're gonna lose a lot of the more up to date kind of stuff. There's just going to be some stuff missing that is valuable. So.
Right. Anything that's free does not include anything that's Dead Sea Scrolls or newer.
Right.
And you have to understand that from a richness of information about the first century world context, that's what you're getting. It's not that it's horrible, it's that it's missing a part of the pie that's now available on the table.
Yeah.
So going again to the bad heart side of things, which does influence some of this stuff, all of us have gotten to that point, like Terry was kind of indicating, where we get up to preach on Sunday, and our Sunday morning didn't go exactly as we intended. Maybe there's a conflict at home. Maybe there's a conflict in the church, and it's about to come out. You are going to preach the laser-scoped lesson that seeks to justify yourself or someone else while condemning your brother for whom the Lord has died. Just on a fundamental fact, that actually happens. It happens to some of the best men that you know, because we are, in the end, men. The
and remember,
they do that too.
Remember that we're men, and so if we're harmed, if we're hurt, if we're emotionally, mentally injured, whatever you want to call, we still got to get up Sunday morning and preach, regardless of any of that. Mm-hmm. And I think the thing that just to help people kind of see, if it could be other things, it could be grief, and I mean, Shane's watching. I know Shane could talk to that. Look, you grieving like Shane's gone through a period of grief in his life. There were times I'm sure that Shane, the last thing he wanted to do was get up and preach. And the challenge there is those are some of the things that our own members don't even come to church for, and we've got to get up and put a tie on in most cases and go to work. So you realize that that's part of life. And as a preacher, you've got to be very cautious not to allow that to become a reason to taint what you're doing. And that's hard. That's challenging and that's difficult.
You can put it this way, and Terry can say what he wants to this. The last year of my work at the church at Jerry Whitson Road in Cokeville was fraught with emotional turmoil on the inside of my heart. It was not because of sin. It was because of the ramifications of departing a group of people that I love, a community that I love, and a work that I love, even though intellectually I knew that it was good for me to do so. And so every single sermon has that swirl inside a person's heart. And the larger the pool that you're swirling around, the more likely it is you get spun up or spun out. And all of those things hurt. And they're going to hurt everybody else too. Managing that is incredibly difficult for everybody. And it's like, oh, yeah, that was a real tough time, Phil. Yeah, it was. But it's not just me. Like, everybody goes through that. Every preacher has variations of that experience. Clark Duggar talked about this phrase he had coined: if you have a short stay at a particular congregation, it's basically an extended gospel meeting. Yeah, that hurts. Because you are putting down roots, and then the roots are torn out. And
I can tell you that I was hurt before it came out that I was going to be leaving, because that decision was kind of made for me. Mm-hmm. And there was a time period that I was hurt, and my preaching suffered because of that. And what was interesting is once it came out and the decision was finally made, you're leaving, and this is how much you have. My preaching actually got better because that internal turmoil that I was carrying. And by the way, as the evangelist, felt it very important, and this went on for a couple of years, to not share that hurt with other people, to not make that a public issue. When that finally came out and it was all over, my preaching got better because I wasn't having this emotional turmoil in all of these things. And my heart wasn't in this constant state of rage, if you will, combined with fear of trying to stay off this leaving as long as possible, to be just blunt and honest. I think one of the things that maybe those non-preachers that are listening maybe to share is just where grace on your part comes into play. And there may be times where somebody we know is hurting so bad that maybe we just say, hey, you're not preaching this Sunday. You need to take a day off. It doesn't count against you. and to reach out and do that. I think that's something that we need to consider more often in those regards, rather than, no, you've used all your vacation weeks and you've got to preach this Sunday no matter what.
Yeah.
And by that I mean things that are very public, things that are very well known. We just need to take care of each other and be understanding.
And it's totally going to be okay in the long run.
Yeah.
Like, it's going to be all right.
Yep.
And that trajectory happens in preaching all the time. You know, if you think about your own experiences, pressure gets on you, you will lessen that pressure, let it loose in some space. Places where you don't want it to happen is where anybody else gets hurt. So you got to learn how to diffuse it. You don't want it to be just directed at your spouse, at your family. You certainly don't want to direct it at your brethren. You don't want to direct it inwardly to yourself, which is what I was doing. You know, those things don't help in the long run. They actually create a kind of a feedback loop where it just gets worse and worse and worse. And so your preaching gets worse, your work gets worse, your attitude gets worse, but you don't actually address the issue. You end up just causing more turmoil. And again, that bad series, that bad actor, that bad heart, in the end, it's you. And your goal, like Edwin pointed out earlier on, was I'm here to fix people. Well, you're not. You're not going to fix folks. We sometimes can't even fix ourselves. Physician, heal thyself doesn't work for us.
We get it. We fall into Phil. We fall into that that issue of the Elijah complex, where we think we're the only one if we're not careful. And that, while that can manifest in a lot of ways, when we can become convinced we're the only one who feels a certain way or who sees a certain thing or understands all the issues at play, when you think you're the only one, that really is bad news. That's bad news. And you need to talk to people. You need to talk to your elders. You need to talk to other preachers. You need to talk to your wife. And I understand that at times, and that's one of the reasons Edwin and I are so close, that there's been a lot of times where I'm close to being that only one mindset, and Edwin's one of my guys. And we talk things out, and he helps me gain perspective. Because when you get into that mindset where you're just ready to go sit under a tree and quit, and you guys still get to preach Sunday morning. That's going to be a bad Sunday morning for everybody.
You know, and by the way, did Edwin try to convince you that Lord of the Rings would solve all that for you?
He has, but he's a liar. Yeah, he's wrong. I'm kidding about being a liar. He just loves Lord of the Rings. In fact, Edwin and I were together, and we had dinner not too long ago, and Edwin still was pushing Lord of the Rings, for those who are curious.
Yeah, it just is. I think I'm about to have him sold on the Wheel of Time series, so I'm going to vacuum up all of his free time for a good 14-book series, and that will distract him from some of the nonsense. That's it for our time today. We do need to kind of close things off. We are on a next step of our agenda for Do the Work. We'll have a couple weeks off. We'll pop up some during the summer if Terry and I have great ideas. But we have some travels planned for both of us, gospel meetings, vacations, etc. And at that point, you'll see some notifications as we get back into the next academic year. That's the current plan for Do the Work to kind of return into its second half of the season. And so the mid-season break is upon us. So if you got topics, ideas that you think are super important in the summer, send them over. Probably won't even be on Tuesdays. Could be on other days. Surprising.
It's crazy. Is that allowed?
I don't care. I do what I want.
I think Facebook would ban us for the wrong day.
Yeah, maybe. I don't know. Terry, any last thoughts for you for this, for other things?
Hey, I really enjoyed all the banter, and I'm going to miss this. I mean, we're taking some weeks off. I think Tuesdays I highlighted my week largely because I get to hang out with Phil, and we just get to be boys on the screen with you guys. But I get to see guys like Hal and his brother Paul and Edwin and Chris and Shane. Just the interaction is something that's it's encouraging. And so, don't be a stranger while we're off the air. And hope you guys have a great summer. And I'm looking forward to being back more permanently in the fall, but maybe a couple times across the next couple of months.
Yep. All right, everyone, take care. May God grant you the grace that you need for today. And if Terry and I can be a blessing to you, just let us know.